Today, you will listen to those two women, pearls in the diaspora, you may say. And I'm very curious what they would tell us, because I expect a break with the traditional view on the Indian diaspora. May I invite you to come forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here this morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting conference. The title of my talk is Moving Beyond a Diasporic Lens, Narrating Mobilities. And that's a very self-consciously chosen title where I've avoided using certain language, like the language of migration, for example. And I've deliberately put the word diasporic in quotation marks to problematize what that means. And I think, what I would really like to do is to try and shift the discourse away from migration to mobilities, right? And you may think that this is splitting hairs, but I think there's an important conceptual shift that will occur in talking about not just mobility, but also mobilities in the plural. And I think that's very important. Let me sort of preface what I'm going to say by locating myself. I think it's very important for academics and scholars to contextualize their own positionalities. Let me say a little bit about myself. Okay, I will even hesitate to use words like originally, but I will say it. So I'm originally from India. I come from the state of Bihar. I was born in a small town in Bihar called Ara, which is now famous because of the movie Anarkali of Ara. But it was also famous for other things like thievery and dacoitry and things like that. But I was born in the state of Ara. When I was 1 year old, I moved to Ludhiana with my father, who was an academic. And I lived in Ludhiana in Punjab for 5 years. And then from there, I moved to the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. And I lived in Hyderabad for 5 years, and that brought me to the age of 11. And at the age of 11, I moved with my father and my family to Singapore. I arrived in Singapore as a member of the second wave of Indian migrants into Singapore. There was, of course, a much earlier movement of people of Indian origin into Malaya, including Singapore. But my father arrived in the mid-1970s. So he was an academic. He was teaching at the Nanyang University in Singapore, and he founded the mass communication department there. Anyway, he moved the family there, and I grew up in Singapore from the age of 11, right? And then when I graduated from high school, I went into the National University of Singapore as an undergraduate student, and I wanted to do medicine, but I didn't have good grades. So I ended up in the arts faculty, which was seen as the dumping ground for most people who didn't make it into the sciences at that point. But it was my good luck to be acquainted with anthropology, and I began to major in anthropology and sociology. So that's my training as an anthropology and sociology student. I did my undergraduate years there, and already when I was an honors student in NUS, I was exposed to a brand of Hinduism in Singapore, which was very unfamiliar to me. So there goes this idea that I was studying my own community, right? Because I was a North Indian, Bihari, Bhojpuri speaking, coming from a family that was Vaishnavite and a follower of Sai Baba devotees, confronting the world of South Indian rural folk popular Hinduism in Malaysia. Right? And the distance between what I was experiencing at a personal level and what I encountered in the space of Singapore couldn't be further, right? So this idea that I was studying my own community immediately needs to be suspended, because it was a very unfamiliar, space that I encountered. Anyway, so I then began to be interested in studying Hinduism in a scholarly manner, right? And I began with the notice of immediate difference from my own personal experience, right? As in terms of the religions that I was exposed to at home. Anyway, so I began to study Hinduism in Singapore. I speak Hindi, which is my mother tongue, and I speak Bhojpuri as well. I managed to keep that up in Singapore. I studied it. I'm quite proficient in Hindi and in Bhojpuri. And I also learned Tamil in order to do field work, which was essential for me, because if I didn't learn the language, then I wouldn't be able to access ethnographically the worlds which my informants were experiencing and articulating. So that's my background, and I wanted to say a little bit about this because I think it's very important not to present a disembodied account of your scholarship. I think, you know, who you are, where you come from, absolutely shapes the kind of discourse that you are then able to produce. And so that's the only reason why I've been self-indulgent and talked about myself as much as I have. This is the body of my scholarship, essentially. And the reason why I've put this up here is to actually highlight two of my books. One is called A New God in the Diaspora, Muneeswaran Worship in Contemporary Singapore. And then the second book that I wanted to highlight is Religion and Commodification. And the subtitle is Merchandising Diasporic Hinduism. In all the work that I've done, these are the two books that actually have the word diaspora or diasporic in the titles. And I wanted to say a little bit about this because in Southeast Asia, through the 80s and 90s, through the 70s even, right, there's been quite a lot of work done on Indians overseas. And in fact, the word that has been used to describe diasporic communities is Indians overseas or Indian communities overseas. The language of diaspora actually didn't exist in the 90s or even in the late 90s. I know it existed in other parts of the world, but I'm talking about scholarship in Southeast Asia about Southeast Asian communities from India. You know, I've been working in this field for, I think now almost 20 years, and it was only in the sort of early 2000s that there was an expectation that I should locate my work in diaspora studies, right? So in a sense, like many people here, perhaps we were doing diaspora studies or what looked like diaspora studies without actually calling it that, right? And I think labels do matter, and I think, you know, being co-opted or having certain labels imposed on our scholarship does matter. So I didn't ever consciously think of myself as doing diaspora studies. I was interested in expressions of Hinduism beyond Indian shores, and I was very fascinated with how Indian communities who had settled in other parts of the world were able to sustain such energetic manifestations of their religious lives under very challenging conditions, right? But I never thought of that as diaspora studies, right? But in 2005, I published the first book, and in fact, I was encouraged by the publisher to frame this as part of the diaspora scholarship, right? And I think that has also had an impact on how scholarship in diaspora studies has just proliferated at such a fantastic rate, right? I mean, there's diaspora of everything right now. And so then subsequently, when I did my 2010 book, again, there was encouragement from the publishers that I should, you know, put the word diaspora in it because it's a very important catchword or buzzword or whatever. I didn't resist it, but I used the term diaspora and diasporic very self-consciously, and certainly I do not use it unproblematically. I do problematize it, and I think that's really the, you know, what I'm going to say today, okay? So that's just by way of introduction. So in other words, I have looked at diaspora in Hindu diaspora in Southeast Asia. I've done fieldwork in Singapore and Malaysia, and I've also done fieldwork in Tamil Nadu because I'm interested in the back and forth of Hindu communities between Singapore and Malaysia as well as Tamil Nadu. And I'm interested in how ideas travel, right? Just not, so I don't think of mobility as a unidirectional flow or in a sort of a linear movement of either people or ideas, but I'm really interested in the back and forth. So for example, my work on the South Indian deity Muneeswaran, whom I only encountered in Singapore. I'd never encountered anything like Muneeswaran before in my own personal experience, and neither had my family or the community that I belong to in Singapore. And this deity has traveled from rural Tamil Nadu into Malaya, but this deity has also traveled back to Tamil Nadu, and I invoked the language of an NRI deity. And so this deity came to Malaya as a rural deity, as a folk deity, as a marginal deity, as a non-Sanskritic deity, but who has now returned to parts of Tamil Nadu as a deity that has been Sanskritized in the diaspora, right? So in the diaspora, this deity became associated with one of the Hindu trinity, Shiva, and so there are temples in Singapore that have been built for Muneeswaran as if he was an incarnation of Shiva. And so I've tracked the movement of the deity from Tamil Nadu to Malaya, and then his move back to Tamil Nadu as an NRI deity with the requisite prestige, and of course invoking the label of the non-resident Indian who goes to the diaspora and then, you know, acquires a new prestige and a new status and then returns home. So that's been my preoccupation with diaspora. So I've looked at diasporic experiences through the lens or the prism of religion and the prism of Hinduism. The other sort of thing that I wanted to mention by way of context was to narrate an encounter I had when I visited Durban in 2006. I was at the International Sociological Association's World Congress in Durban in 2006. Some of you were there, I'm sure, and remember that there were 6,000 sociologists who descended upon Durban in that year. And I, of course, was very interested in trying to figure out, or at least have a glimpse of Hinduism in South Africa. And so I requested a taxi driver, and the hotel concierge gave me the name of a woman taxi driver, because she said it was very unsafe for me to travel with a male taxi driver in Durban. So I was introduced to a woman by the name of Mrs. Urmila Singh. She was extremely helpful and showed me the major temples in Durban, Hindu temples in Durban. And then she introduced me to her husband, a man I was introduced to as Sunny Singh, who was 67 years old at the time. And he was extremely keen to connect with his roots back in India, right? So his great-grandfather had come to South Africa to work in the sugar factory. And this gentleman, Mr. Sunny Singh, didn't know anything about his grandfather's village, or except that he came from a village in Bihar. That's all he knew. And so I said to him, he asked me, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Bihar. And he said, can you help me find my ancestors, right? And of course, this is not a new, everyone knows that this is very much the sentiment and the feeling of many descendants of, indentured labor, other categories of migrants who have this desire, this intense desire to connect. Anyway, I met him in July 2006 in Durban, and then in December 2006, he was at my parents' home in Patna with his wife. He had traveled, it was his first trip ever to India, and he went to Patna with the intention of finding his family, and he had absolutely no information. He didn't know anything. He didn't have photographs. He didn't have any memorabilia. But I was really taken with this sort of the intensity of his desire to know his ancestors, and I think that really deeply impacted the way that I had been thinking about diasporic experiences. And this, he expressed an almost a visceral connection. So this is personally connected to me because he ended up in my parents' home, who were then living in Patna, and they hosted him, and my father, being a communications man, organized press conferences and television appearances for him, where this gentleman narrated his story to people. And it was quite remarkable, the number of people who actually turned up in my parents' home trying to find out if they were indeed related to this gentleman, right? And many of them came and they brought photographs and other memorabilia to make the connection, etc. And unfortunately, there was nothing conclusive, and so the couple left disappointed. But this whole experience of trying to find your ancestors, it really resonated, I think, with some of my own work in Singapore that I had been doing, where I had encountered sort of 6th and 7th generation Tamil Hindus. I'm talking about 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, right, who had this intense desire to connect with their ancestry and to learn about what they called the ways of the ancestors, the old ways, right? And they were wanting to connect with sort of rural folk Hindu practices, which had long sort of disappeared from the urban context of Singapore, and they were trying to bring back some of these old ways and to reconnect. And this idea of wanting to reconnect, I found a very compelling sort of observation, and I saw this with Mr. Sunny Singh as well. We still keep in touch, and he still asks me, have you found, has anyone else come to find out about who I am? And I think I can only describe it as a kind of a almost visceral connection to the land, which is very difficult to articulate. And in fact, when he was interviewed in the local press, he said, and I quote, he said, "I was simply overwhelmed on arriving to India, and I turned emotional when I came to Bihar because of my blood connections with the land. I felt something special, something unique," right? And I think part of my own effort to continue to sort of unpack diasporic experiences really, what does it mean to be connected by blood in this visceral, emotional way to something that you have never seen, but you've heard about, and it's part of your inheritance and part of your legacy. Then I wanted to now turn to the enormous body of literature. The slide looks very crowded, and it's intentional, and it doesn't capture everything that has been written. I think the scholarship in diaspora is so are huge right now and so varied and so diverse. It tells us that this is an empirically rich field of scholarship which attends to multiple contrasting diasporic experiences across time and space. Some of the books that are here have authors in this room, and many whom I've not been able to put up here, but this is a very rich field, and it's trying to attend to multiple and contrasting diasporic experiences across time and space, where different categories of mobility have been mapped, documented, and theorized. Sociocultural model and political economy models of diasporic experiences have been offered to us. If I can just make some sort of broad statements without eliminating the particularities, we can say that Indian communities overseas have constituted themselves in ways that have allowed them to sustain vibrant and energetic manifestations of community life beyond Indian shores, producing a complex and dynamic cultural tapestry. Indian overseas have grounded themselves in new social, cultural, political terrains. They have built families and communities, sustained languages and art forms, moved their gods and modes of venerating them into new territories, reproduced ways of their ancestors, but also forged new communities and new solidarities. Producing a sense of home in strange, unfamiliar lands has entailed making new connections while energetically sustaining old ones in a new milieu. Known and recognizable cultural and political sentiments, ideologies, ambitions, practices, and institutions have been implanted with inevitable differences, but without registering radical departures from the familiar. The once upon a time migrant communities have not remained isolated in new environments. Individuals have interacted across ethnic, religious, and class boundaries, forging important new ties and alliances. Inspiration is found and opportunities seized for innovating tradition anew, created by consciously remembering and embracing some legacies while gratefully glossing over others. It is a delicate balancing act of sorts where features of an inherited tradition are honed inventively, even as completely novel cultural formulations are imagined and enacted in the diaspora. Thank you very much. Of course, benefit from the wonderful work that has already been produced, some of which is listed here. But with this sort of background, I want to now narrate to you my own ethnography of the Indian community in Singapore, because I think I'm an ethnographer. I'm trained in anthropology, but I'm essentially an ethnographer. And I always privilege ethnography before so-called theory, not because I think of ethnography as devoid of theory, but I want to privilege the ethnography, and I want to present that to you first. Okay, so with that, let me try and talk about Singapore's Indian communities. I mean, we've been hearing about indentured histories. Yesterday's, the kind of migration that happened in Southeast Asia was very different from the kinds of experiences of indentured history. First of all, you can see from the data from 1880 to 1896, it's a very small frame, but you can see that indentured labor constituted a very small part of the kind of migration practices that existed for the Indian community in Southeast Asia. It was really, yesterday we talked about the Kangani and the Maestri systems of migration, which were very different in many ways, but we were actually didn't unseat the basic relationship of subordination and exploitation that defined indentured labor migration as well. But you can see the indentured labor constituted a very small percentage of the total migration of Indians into Southeast Asia, right? So there was some indentured labor migration, but it was also Kangani system, which is the overseer model of migration, and also a lot of passage of free Indians. So I should say that Singapore is very different from even parts of Malaya, right? Singapore was a port city, and there were no plantations as such in Singapore that required large numbers of indentured labor. But port cities like Singapore required labor to build the colony from its so-called early beginnings as a fishing village, which is a bit of a myth. It was more than a fishing village in 1819 when Stamford Raffles arrived there. But nonetheless, there were large numbers of Indian convict labor that was sent to Singapore as a port city to build the infrastructure of the city. So it was the Indian convict labor that built roads, that built bridges, that built hotels, that built cathedrals, that built Chinese temples and Hindu temples, many of which still stand today, right? So, it was a very huge contribution of the convict labor community to literally building the infrastructure of the city. But indentured labor, I want to highlight, was a small part of it. Just to give you a sense of the growth of the Indian community, so, Singapore as a port city was founded in 1819, and, in terms of the census data, it suggests that there weren't very many Indians at the time, but the population soon grew between 1821 with a mere 132 Indians to 2009 with almost 350,000 Indians. I mean, that's been the kind of dramatic rise of the Indian population in Singapore. Okay, if you look at of course, as all diasporic communities, the one in Singapore is also extremely diverse, right? It's defined by lots of internal complexity, and some of the linguistic groups that are represented there include the Tamils, the Malayalis, the Hindi, and the Hindustani. And to reference the Hindustani here, so the Hindustani is, of course, before the start of the nation state. In the colonial period, that people identified themselves as Hindustanis, and then there are people who've come recently who call themselves Hindi-speaking, and so that. And then in Singapore, it's a very peculiar situation where the Indian community basically recognizes everybody who came from the subcontinent, right? So it includes, Sri Lankans, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, as well as Indians. So this data is from the Singapore census 2010. So it's a very diverse community in terms of the linguistic backgrounds. In terms of the religious background as well, you see a hugely multi-religious society. Within the Indian community, Hinduism is the largest proportion, followed by Islam, Christianity, other religions, and no religions, right? So I just wanted to show this to give you a sort of sense of how diverse the community is linguistically. And in terms of the where the Indian community is positioned within the Singapore story, so it is a minority community, absolutely. It is after the Chinese constitute about 74% of the population. The Malay community, which is the indigenous community of the island, is 13%, and then the Indian community is 9.2%, and then others, including Eurasians, etc. So the Indian community is a minority community, but in the last 20 years, the Indian community has actually grown quite substantially due to the third and fourth waves of migrations that have happened, and significantly enough to register a percentage change. So it used to be 7.9% 15 years ago, and today it's 9.2%, which is not insignificant. So that's the sort of background of the Indian community. So let me just talk about the Indian community now. So historically, Indian arrivals to Singapore, parts of my paper are written, so I'm just going to read some of them. So historically, Indian arrivals to Singapore grounded themselves in new social, cultural, political terrains. They built families and communities, and the diverse Indian community in Singapore constituted itself in ways that allowed it to sustain vibrant manifestations of community life, creating space for a multitude of social, cultural, and religious expressions. Yet the community has not remained isolated in its new environment. Its members interacted across ethnic, religious, and class boundaries. The 2010 census of Singapore registered the size of the Indian community as 9.2% of the total resident population. In another important statistic, between 2000 and 2010, the number of Singapore permanent residents, these are like the green card holders, from within the Indian community had doubled from 16.6 to 31%. Increasingly, the dichotomy of Singapore Indians and Indian Indians and the assumed cultural and other differences between them have appeared forcefully in the discourse within the community. So there's a kind of a polarization. And I mean, really looking at the Indian community today, you see a layered community where you have members of a much older wave of mobility into the island in the early decades of the 19th century. And then over the decades, there have been different waves of movements into the island. And today, the differences are recognized in terms of these two categories. So people recognize what they call Singapore Indians, and they talk about the Indian Indians, right, which really registers the kind of distinction that people who've settled there for much longer periods feel about these new arrivals. The current Indian community in Singapore is multiply layered in being marked by tremendous diversity and density, as well as through fissures and tensions. And I think this is one of the key points I'd like to make, that I think in diaspora studies, there is a need to speak explicitly about the politics of diasporic experiences, which I think isn't talked about as much. And I'm talking about politics within the so-called same Indian community, right? So it's not between Indians and non-Indians, but the idea that within the so-called Indian community. I should also preface my remarks by saying that this is something of an irony. So the reason why there are these large numbers of new Indians in Singapore now is because in the mid-1990s, the Singapore government decided that in order, so Singapore has experienced some level of brain drain out of the country, right? And its demography is also crippled by very low fertility rates. In fact, now Singapore has negative fertility growth, and so Singapore is not even able to reproduce, and maintain its population levels. So anyway, in the mid-90s, the leaders of Singapore decided that they wanted to embark on a very conscious policy of migration, where they wanted to invite people with the right ethnicities to come into the country, right? And the right ethnicities were the Chinese and the Indians, and to some extent the Malays. So they consciously courted Chinese from Hong Kong, from Taipei, from mainland China, from North America, and invited them to come to Singapore to become part of the Singaporean community. And they also invited Indians from India as well as from Europe and North America. Professional educated Indians is what they were after. And the argument was that if you invite people who are similar to Indians or Chinese in Singapore, then you would actually maintain some kind of a harmonious balance, right? And the presumption was that if you were, labeled Indian or Chinese, that you would be the same, but to the shock and horror of the Singapore government, as well as its Indian and Chinese communities, once the new Indians and new Chinese had come into Singapore, we began to see these new fault lines that emerged, where people from mainland China were obviously very, very different from the ethnic Chinese in Singapore in terms of their attitudes, their cultures, their behaviors, etc. And similarly for the Indian community. So in a sense, this policy has kind of backfired, because it has created these internal fault lines within the community, which the community now has to negotiate, because there are large numbers of new Indians that have arrived into Singapore. So the current community in Singapore is layered in being marked by this tremendous diversity and also by conflicts and tensions. Unsurprisingly, the reconfigured demography and profile of the Indian community has produced new social cultural dynamics and led to significant and irreversible transformations on several fronts. Public debates over the possibility and desirability of first inviting and then integrating and assimilating foreigners, it's a term that I use in quotations because I think it's quite a problematic term and politically loaded, of inviting and then assimilating foreigners into Singaporean social life have flooded both the print and online media. The difference between new Indian migrants and the old settled segments of the community have been noted by all parties. And this has really led to a discourse in Singapore that is asking people to rethink relations between citizens and the state, between migrants and the state, between claims to rights and entitlements that migrants can make and that citizens can make. And there's been a demand internally from citizens that the Singapore government needs to make very fine distinctions between the real Indians in Singapore and those that are just passing through, right? So it's really created a vibrant discourse locally about what it means to be Indian and what it means to be a Singaporean Indian as opposed to an Indian from India or an Indian from elsewhere. And I'm sure these sort of debates are happening in other places as well. Critical questions have also surfaced about how non-Indian Singaporeans view members of the Indian community and what is their status and image today. The presence, yet again, of South Asian males engaged in manual labor refreshes historical memories about the arrivals of, I've been told to cut, really? Okay, all right. Okay, so I wanted to talk about Indian connectivity and is this the grounds for sameness or difference? The existence of long-standing links with India assumes specific significance for discourses of an emergent, settled community in contrast to a migratory one. For overseas Indians, both the recognition of links with India and a disconnect from India and all things Indian can and have been politicized. For settled communities, being described or mistaken as migrants are seen to delegitimate claims to citizenship rights and entitlements. Indeed, this misrecognition has been the basis for tensions and conflicts between old and new Indian arrivals to Singapore, and people don't like being mistaken. So settled members of the community don't like being asked, when did you come to Singapore, right? So I wanted to talk about, actually I don't have time, but this idea of connectivity with the home. And of course the connectivity with the home has not been possible or desired by everyone, but for many people the connectivity with India continues. But I wanted to raise questions about whether the notion of connectivity with India is a problem and for whom. And is it a problem for the state? I mean, is it reflective of divided loyalties or for others in Singapore? So for example, recently, when I came back from India, I had a Chinese taxi driver pick me up from the airport, and he asked me, why is it that Indians like to go to India so much, right? And I said, well, don't Chinese? And he said, no, Chinese don't like to go to China so much, but I've noticed that Indians like to go to India all the time. And he was trying to understand this, right? I mean, actually, the real sort of point of my talk was this one. So I'm going to take the liberty and take 5 minutes to get through this. So I do want to talk about going beyond the diasporic lens. And I thought it's a useful reminder in some ways to go back to what we understand by diaspora, because in a lot of this discussion, that seems to have been taken for granted. So of course, diaspora is, the dispersion of any people from their original homeland. It talks about dispersion or scattered as noun. It signifies a group of people who have been dispelled from their ancestral homeland and now live themselves in two or more locations, right? Of course, it has this idea of traveling away from home. Now, I think, there has been a lot of interesting work done on this right now, and students of mobility speak of sojourners and settlers, of return migration, of the twice, thrice migrant, of permanency and transience, of rootedness and home. But debates about extending the meanings and connotations of the term diaspora from the original Jewish model to encapsulate the experiences and identities of other mobilities continues. It's not been settled, right? In my own sort of approach to this, that there is a need to look beyond the diasporic lens. And what does this mean? I think there is an aspiration and a search for a new conceptual language for articulating the complexities of flows and minorities, not just of people and ideas, but objects, sentiments, affects, cultural memories, and imaginaries. In the literature, we read of unfinished migration, of partial migration, which are all nuanced modes of discoursing experiences of mobilities. I speak of mobilities actually as an unfinishable project. And I think, this is not a weakness, but I think it is the very nature of mobility itself. And I think this is where we need to problematize the homeland diaspora binary. We need to problematize the home versus the homeland, and indeed to ask what it means to be settled community and whether citizenship guarantees permanent settlement, right? I mean, we've seen that it doesn't, because even with citizenship, you can always be in a sojourning mood. So I think these are some fundamental questions about, looking through the diasporic lens. And I do think the homeland diaspora binary is rigid, and the lens diasporic models offers are both unproductive in theorizing complex experiences of movements and mobilities. I have approached diasporic sites as sites of creativity and innovation, but without overlooking tensions and conflicts. In a recent volume, people have talked about not approaching diaspora as unproblematic sites, that they shouldn't necessarily be seen always as sites of celebration, but these are really problematic sites, and we need to pay attention to how these sites are being produced. I've been quite excited by some new stuff that I have been reading about mobilities, and clearly we don't want to approach mobility as a linear, singular, unidirectional movement of individuals or communities. There's just one thing I wanted to highlight from this new literature, and this is the notion of post-diaspora. Some of you, I'm sure, have come across this, and I think this is quite an exciting development, and I just want to end on this slide. So this is a description of a post-diaspora that's taken from the African Caribbean Women's Mobility and Self-Fashioning in Post-Diaspora Context Network. The reference is there, you can go in and look it up. And I think their articulation of post-diaspora is actually quite empowering. It says, post-diaspora is neither a departure from nor a continuation of contemporary usages of diaspora. Rather, the post signals a new problem space that allows us to imagine new futures by focusing on mobility, both as a defining feature of Caribbean identities and as a route to self-fashioning of African Caribbean women. And this is the part that I really like. Rather than linear journeys that result in the reconstitution of a remembered past in a present of new physical and cultural geographies, post-diasporic journeys are rhizomatic. They radically reconfigure the assumed significance of home and away. In rhizomatic journeys, roots are provisional and unfixed, and I think this is really important, and which leads us to rethink what does it mean to belong and where one belongs, right? And roots are often circuitous and return physical, rhetorical, and economic. And I think here, for me, lies the potential in moving beyond the diasporic lens, which is not a denial of the contributions that diaspora literature has made, but which allows us to rethink notions of home, notions of homeland. What does it mean to be settled? What does it mean to be mobile? And I think these are sort of fundamental questions that lead to our sense of personhood and solidarity and community. And I look forward to seeing more work that takes us in this sort of different conceptual direction. Thank you very much. And my apologies for the time.